Alright, okay, I'm not going to touch this anymore. Alright, so this is my paper. One Life, Ephraim, Asenath, and Edward, attempting to untangle the mind, body, and phallus in Lovecraft's The Thing on the Doorstep. The question of mind versus body has been mulled over by centuries of philosophers. Indeed, philosophy has an entire field reserved for pursuits along this line of thought, philosophy of mind. This field can be said to begin roughly with the writings of the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle. Continue on through the centuries in the works of thinkers like Descartes, Hegel, Lacan, Marx, Foucault, and Derrida. And it survives more recently in the persons of Rearick, Dennett, Langer, Sagan, and Nagel. But literature too probes these questions, from the invention of man of Shakespeare to the multiplicity of self in writers like Robert Louis Stevenson and Cicero, to the instability of identity in writers like Clare, James Joyce, John Berryman, and the language poets. These questions of self, mind, body, and identity are the focus of H.P. Lovecraft's 1933 short story, The Thing on the Doorstep. The story, which follows narrator Dan Upton's retelling of his murder of close friend Edward Durfee, raises, and occasionally answers, many compelling questions about the relationship between the mind and the body, and the relationship of the two with the theoretical fallacies of Freud, Lacan, and, to a degree, Judith Butler. The story involves many instances of mind-body switching, and eventually makes clear a path of transition from Ephraim, the father of Asenath Waite, Edward's wife, to Asenath and then onward to Edward. In doing so, Lovecraft makes an argument for the preeminence of the mind over the body in determining identity, and comments on gender and sexuality in ways that are advanced for his time. I thought, oh, that must be wrong then. Such claims position Lovecraft as a writer dealing with the complexities of poststructuralist questioning of truth and the self, third-wave feminist critiques of the solidity of gender and the dichotomy of sexuality, and philosophy of mind's various conclusions about the knowability of the self and the potential for the self's reconstruction and recreation. The Thing on the Doorstep begins with a telling assertion of the preeminence of the mind over the body in the establishing of identity. That is to say, because an exchange of minds results in the creation of two entirely new entities. For example, one in which Ephraim's body has Asenath's mind in it, and one in which Asenath's body has Ephraim's mind in it. These entities are identifiable through their minds primarily, and through their physical bodies secondarily. Upton thus begins the story by remarking, "It is true that I have sent 6 bullets through the head of my best friend, and yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer." Upton centers his proof around fact rather than conjecture or opinion. Quote, "Later, some of my readers will weigh each statement, correlate it with known facts, and ask themselves how I could have believed otherwise than I did after facing the evidence of that horror," end quote. Though Upton feels he may be, quote, "mad himself," end quote, he also laughs at the weakly concocted theories of police, who are at their, quote, "wits' ends," end quote. Ultimately, Upton is a philosopher, and not a romantic in the model of identity questioners like Dostoevsky's Underground Man and Nabokov's Charles Cambodian. He takes the evidence in via his senses and interprets it based on the most logical, though not always the sanest, interpretation. And he questions any conclusions that don't line up with what he knows to be true. This makes Upton more Cartesian than Shakespearean or Sisyphean, more Sherlock Holmes than Leopold Bloom. Because Upton resists the conclusions he is ultimately forced to come to, and even as he takes part in Edward's murder, admits that a man must sometimes, quote, "strike before reckoning the consequences," end quote. His approach to the events that unfolded The Thing on the Doorstep prepare readers to similarly approach those conclusions from a philosopher's rather than an artist's perspective. Such a move becomes important in interpreting even the first paragraph of the story. Upton puts forward his position on the separation of mind and body, the preeminence of the former over the latter, when he asserts that he is not the murderer of his best friend. The entity he shot was not Edward, he claims, because it was the mind of the old man Ephraim in Edward's body. This may seem to be a somewhat obvious conclusion based on the plot of the story, but as we shall see momentarily, it is an area of much disagreement in the philosophical field concerning the mind and self. And Edward himself, though frequently in the grips of unimaginable horrors, seems at times not to agree with it, persisting in calling Asenath she, even after he is aware that her body houses Ephraim's mind. Before any further arguments are advanced, I want to take just a step to summarize the plot of The Thing on the Doorstep. The story is told from the perspective of Daniel Upton, an architect and Harvard grad practicing in Lovecraft's Arkham, and it principally concerns his relationship with Miskatonic University student Edward Derby. Edward is a scholar of fantasy and strangeness, as well as a Poe-like poet, and the coddled child of well-off parents. He eventually falls in love with, or at least under the influence of, Asenath Waite, the unnerving daughter of Ephraim Waite, an old man well known, feared, and avoided on account of his prodigious talents in the dark arts. Asenath is also heir to the legend of the Innsmouth Waites, a family rumored to be connected to horrible bargains and a strange element not quite human. Edward and Asenath eventually marry, and what follows is a tale of horror only a careful reading can fully unravel. At the story's conclusion, we as readers know the full extent of Ephraim's evil, how he forced Asenath out of her own body, completely conquering her and trapping her in his own frail body, how he, in her guise, seduced Edward in hopes of similarly conquering him and taking his body, how Edward was able to fight him off for a while but not forever, how Edward was forced into the mutilated corpse of Asenath as Ephraim finally gained control of the weaker man's body, and how, steeled by the dying Edward's final pleading note, Upton shot Ephraim, seemingly killing his best friend, but, in his mind, killing the old wizard. This complex plot centers itself around three areas of particular interest, and I hope to go through all three of them today. The favoring of the mind over the body in the well-known Cartesian duality, the conception of gender as it relates to the knowledge phallus, which is an idea familiar for readers of Foucault. The knowledge power of discipline and punishment is what I'm referring to here. And complications these mind-body switches present for a reading of the sexuality present in the story. It is readily apparent that Lovecraft's story accepts the Cartesian model of the mind-body dichotomy. The French Enlightenment philosopher famously stated that the only thing he could be certain of was that he was at that moment thinking, a realization that led him to postulate that the mind and body must be different things. In his meditations on first philosophy, Descartes concluded that the mind is an immaterial thing, and that it was the essence of the man to whom it belonged, which causally interacts with the body, a non-thinking, ontologically separate entity in which the mind is housed. In Descartes' writings, the mind is given clear superiority over the body, both by the nature of its ontological certainty and by its representation as the quintessence of its subject. Following Descartes' model, the thing on the doorstep takes the mind-over-body approach to personal identity. Throughout the story, persons are identified by the entity controlling the body, the mind, or the spirit of the person, rather than the physical body they occupy, except on those occasions where the speaker is not aware, or willing to accept, that mind-body switches are possible. This is shown not only in the book's opening, in which Upton denies being Edward's murderer on the basis of Edward's body being under Ephraim's control, but also in passages like this one. Quote, the caller had vowed that in that instant the sad, muddled eyes of poor Edward were gazing out from Asenath's body, end quote. And in the revelation of Edward that Asenath, quote, isn't really Asenath at all, but really old Ephraim himself. I know it now, end quote. In the Lovecraftian world of hideous exchanges of personality, such switches of mind to different bodies are a question of willpower. Both Asenath and Edward are chosen because they are weak and childish, both in will and constitution, with the former being a prime candidate due to her gender, as I hope to get to shortly. Ephraim is able to crowd Asenath out of her own body entirely, and he accomplishes the same task with Edward, though with much greater difficulty. Indeed, Upton seems to be steeling himself for an attempt on Ephraim's part on his identity when he resolves at the end of the story, quote, I will not be driven out of my own body. I will not change souls. There's an exclamation point. This superiority of the mind over the body in determining identity is even given support from naturalism. Lovecraft adds about Asenath, who is being controlled by Ephraim's mind, that, quote, animals markedly disliked her, and she could make any dog howl by certain motions of her hand, end quote, taking the conception of the mind as chief determinant of identity outside of the purely philosophical realm and placing it in the realm of the natural as well. Gender and sex play a pivotal role in the plot and character motivations of the thing on the doorstep. Lovecraft's story seems, at its surface, to take the stance of third-wave feminism towards sex and gender as identity categories. Among other things, third-wave feminism clarifies and solidifies the position that the two categories are entirely separate from one another, with sex being primarily biological and gender being primarily a function of one's culture and personality. Certainly, Lovecraft's story very explicitly argues for a clear distinction between the two categories. The hideous exchange can occur regardless of the sex or gender of the exchanger and the body of the recipient. That is, Ephraim can occupy both the bodies of Asenath and Edward at separate times, even though he is male in gender. Furthermore, it is clear that the mind, regardless of the body that it is housed in, retains whatever gender-coded characteristics it had previously. Neither Edward nor Ephraim become more feminine in personality while occupying Asenath's body. Because these switches are centered around the conception of personality and identity as located in the mind, the sex of the body occupied is of little relevance. Masculinity and femininity are products of the self, and therefore of the mind, since Lovecraft is taking the Cartesian position, and thus are not determined by the biology of the physical form in which a mind is contained. In this way, Lovecraft follows third-wave feminism's distinction between sex and gender very closely. But this distinction alone is not the telos of third-wave feminism. And Lovecraft's conception of gender and sex in The Thing on the Doorstep must be separated from some of the movement's further exploration of this thing. Most relevantly, Lovecraft's use of sex and gender must be distinguished from the idea of gender performativity, for which Judith Butler is usually credited. In her books on the subject, Butler argues that gender is not an inherent thing tied to biological sex, nor a solidified state that one is born possessing, but rather that it is a culturally constructed way of understanding one's identity that must be continuously reified by one's actions, that is literally performed, in the sense that masculinity and femininity are arbitrary markers. A common misconception of this concept is that it paints such performances in an inherently negative light. If the idea that gender is a static natural thing is one that must be deconstructed, wouldn't it stand to reason that any performance of gender would be counterintuitive to this goal? But Butler's belief is that the fluidity of gender, posited by her arguments, makes self-construction of gender, in any permutation, a viable and healthy option for understanding oneself. This greatly informs her concept of the lesbian phallus. Okay, perfect. Butler's lesbian phallus is a rejection of the masculine and heterosexual phalluses of Lacan and Freud. Both of these highly influential thinkers understood the phallus to be the seat of power in any relational or epistemological dynamic. For Freud, the phallus was mostly related to his understandings of the human psyche and the genesis and expression of human sexuality. So his phallus in its simplest form was the locus of intellectual power and sexual dominion. In contrast, Lacan's phallus is the result of the post-structural shift from the first order of signification of Saussure to second order signification of Barthes and Lacan himself. Lacan saw power, and consequently the phallus, as primarily encapsulated in words. This logocentric approach to the phallus was the result of a post-structural understanding of truth that separated that we know from that we can never know. Along with Sisu and Rearick, Butler attempted to move away from conceptions of the phallus that were ultimately ingrained in a culture that normativized whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. So Butler's lesbian phallus is ultimately about transferability. If the phallus can be moved from person to person, regardless of their race, gender, and sexuality, then that is the lesbian phallus. And then, so one can obviously see here how a Butlerian reading of the mind-body switching in Lovecraft's story might function. If the phallus is power, and if knowledge is power, then it makes sense that transferability of knowledge would indicate a reorienting, or rather reconstructing of the phallus from its initial position within a matrix of white/male/heterosexual normativity into a new matrix, creating a lesbian phallus. But such a reading of The Thing on the Doorstep, even if it's easy, would ultimately be a misreading. Though it's true that the phallus is centered in knowledge in the story, particularly a knowledge in the dark arts, it's not transferable in Butler's sense. It's here that the lines between Butler's arguments and Lovecraft's must be clearly drawn. For both, gender and sex are discrete entities, but Butler's gender performativity has no parallel in Lovecraft's story. While both Edward and Ephraim do occupy Asenath's body, the genders of the respective occupants are never in flux. It is Ephraim in the disguise of Asenath who proudly boasts that, quote, she is not a man, since she believed a male brain had a certain unique and far-reaching cosmic power that a female did not, end quote. So the occupation of a female's body obviously has no effect on Ephraim's opinion of femininity or of female as a gender category. In fact, it seems more that his understanding of females as being inferior or even subhuman has been solidified by his occupation of his daughter's body. Beyond that, the same seems to be true with Edward, and I have a quote here, but I'm going to skip it so I can get to the next paragraph. Knowing all these things that I just said, it's impossible to see the phallus in Lovecraft's story as lesbian. Instead, it's the Lacanian phallus that Lovecraft seems to be most close to employing. Recall that Lacan's phallus is logocentric, that is, primarily deriving its power from words as singular entities. So too does the knowledge power of Ephraim center around words, the words in the forbidden tomes of the Miskatonic University Library, the disturbing and cryptic Thubian, in which he is given a new name, Kamok, is his new name, and is brought closer to the undefined power he is seeking. Furthermore, this knowledge power of The Thing on the Doorstep have shades of the post-structuralist linguistic relativism. The ability to have mastery in unknown forces comes to knowledge through language, but it doesn't have application outside of the dark arts of obtaining more forbidden literature, mind-body switches, taking part in unearthly rituals, that sort of thing. Just as language is a closed system for Lacan, a rose is a rose is a rose, and the Lacanian phallus is simply the height of power within that system, so too is the knowledge phallus and the thing on the doorstep part of a closed system of dark arts. Though Upton is often subject to these forces, he's never envious of them or desirous of acquiring them, and Edward too is ready to give up his studies at various points during the story. Unlike the Freudian and Butlerian phalluses, both of which undergird all social interactions, the Lacanian phallus is centered around language as words and is trapped within that system. So too is the phallus in Lovecraft's story trapped within the system of the dark arts. And I have one more section, but I think I'm just going to stop here because I'm about to run out of time. Cool. Awesome. Thanks, guys.